Just click.
There we go. All right. I think we have an interesting topic here. BDD, at least for me, I have experienced a little bit, but definitely I'm not an expert or anything like that. I'm looking forward to see this exciting topic from Leslie. Thanks, Leslie, for being with us. And you had been the BDD coach. I was looking at your LinkedIn, and awesome. At least the coaching perspective and all, we can definitely utilize your services. I think at this point. I've heard a little bit about TDD, the test-driven development, but not much into the BDD. Though we use some UI UX journeys to figure out how the development needs to happen, but I'm sure that I'm definitely not on the right track. With that, Leslie, do you want to kickstart the conference?
Certainly. So this evening we are going to talk about 5 good reasons to add BDD to your Agile practices. Our agenda is we're going to show 5 ways that BDD strongly supports Agile development. And we're going to do that by specifically referring to the principles behind the Agile Manifesto. And then we're going to provide a brief introduction to what is BDD, how do you actually do it. This is going to be a very brief introduction. I normally teach a 2 or 3 day class plus 1 day to cover test automation. And we're going to have a total of about 20 minutes. So there's a lot that we won't cover today, but it will give you at least an understanding of the principles and where to begin. And then I'm going to try to provide just a little bit of guidance on critical next steps for implementation. So one of the principles behind the Agile Manifesto is face-to-face conversation. That's the most effective way of conveying information. Well, BDD doesn't tell us what we're doing, but it does say it's development, which means it's the developers doing it. But there's a better name for BDD. It's specification by example. And that says that we are writing requirements with examples. And developers don't write requirements. The SBE BDD methodology says that we should always write those requirements collaboratively. They call it the 3 amigos, the product owner or BA, whoever writes the requirements in your company, with the developers and the QAs working collaboratively. Another principle behind the Agile Manifesto, simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done. I like that, the way they phrased that. Well, SBE is not a tool, it's a methodology. So done properly, it is a systemic change. It isn't just a new way to write requirements or to do QA, it's a paradigm shift. Just as waterfall to Agile was a paradigm shift. And it significantly changes the entire process. And eliminating things certainly sounds like simplification and leaving work not done. And shortening processes is Agile. So here is a typical development process. There are manual test cases that are written and run before the automation team begins automating. Test case execution starts after the code is written and delivered to QA. The SBE or BDD development process, we're consistently, if we're doing this well, we are consistently delivering automated tests to the developers in sprint. That means regression tests and tests for new functionality. And I forgot to mention earlier, if you have questions, please jump right in and ask them. I would rather have you ask them during the presentation while it's relevant and fresh on people's minds rather than try to go back afterwards and ask them. So jump right in.
Question, Leslie.
Go ahead.
So I'm still not able to understand this. So writing requirements, and you said that there will be a continuous automation of writing the requirements and delivering it to the developers. So do you mean that within the given sprint, do I need to do this first and then I need to engage the developers, or do I need to do this ahead of the sprint? Like for example, I need in this sprint I will automate the requirements, and the next sprint they will do the development. Is that how it is?
No, no, you're creating the automation in the same sprint in which you deliver it and in the same sprint for which the developers during which the developers are writing the code. So first you write the requirements collaboratively, and sometimes as soon as a few requirements have been written, the QA team can begin automating. And then they deliver that automation before the developers finish writing the code.
Okay.
And we'll see how that's done. It sounds insane. But it does. I mean, I told a QA team at General Motors that we were going to do that, and they just looked at me like, "You are nuts." Because we've
Can't
been
wait to see this. This is right up my alley. I love this.
they were like, "We've been in
It's
QA
surprising.
for a long time, and this is not the way it ever happens." So this development process leaves a lot of work not done. Here's a typical defect lifecycle, well, a simplified defect lifecycle. A typical development process has this feedback loop where the QA team writes defects and puts them into the tracking system and manages them through the defect lifecycle. And this diagram does not begin to capture all of the arguments that take place, but managing the defects is a lot of work. And code gets delivered after all of the bugs are fixed, or more realistically, after developers announce that they are losing the will to live. And the product owner decides to accept some bugs and defer fixing them until later. And here's the SBE defect lifecycle. There's no defect lifecycle. A team using SBE doesn't need a defect lifecycle because the developers are running all of the tests. Regression tests and tests for new functionality, not just on every build, but every time they get ready to open a PR. And if one of the tests fails, the developer fixes the bug right there. They know exactly which lines of code they were changing, so they can fix the bug really quickly. And they don't open a pull request until all of the tests pass. So is there any value in tracking a defect that not only never gets to production, it never gets to the QA team? This leaves a lot more work not done. And again, this is crazy.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Leslie. Can you remind me the acronym SBE?
Specification by example, the better name for BDD.
I love that. Specification by example.
We're writing requirements that include examples.
So let me visualize this in my mind. If you go back, Leslie, there, sorry for that. So I'm just going, definitely it's a new concept. So I'm trying to embrace
It's
this
a
one.
paradigm shift.
So so I will have my product owner and the scrum master, and then maybe even the business lead, whoever is giving us the sponsors, or whoever, like 3 or 4 amigos, whoever that is. So we will write the user stories. So basically what you're saying is, a BA, for example, in this case, let's say in our companies, at least I've seen mostly the BAs write the user stories. So what you're saying is the BAs will start writing SPEs, like basically instead of user story, you'll be writing SPE.
Yes, we'll see how that's done. A requirement using specification, written using specification by example, is more detailed than a user story. So the hierarchy is take a user story, write a requirement from that. And we will see that. I'll show an example of that, several examples later in the presentation.
Sounds good then. Cool. Thanks. I'll wait. Thank you.
Typical document flow. A traditional development process requires multiple documents. We've got the requirements documents. The developers create architectural documents. And then the developers often create detailed design documents that include additional boundary conditions and corner cases. And the QA team writes test cases from the requirements. And then they have to have a requirements traceability matrix. So we know which test cases to review and change when the requirements change, and when test cases fail, we can point back to the requirements and say, this is the requirement that's impacted. And these documents are all decoupled. If we make changes to the requirements, those changes have to be manually propagated to the other documents. And we all know that manual updating may never happen. And design documents that contain additional boundary conditions will probably never be reviewed by the product owner. This is an opportunity for the developers to write high quality code that does the wrong thing. And the test cases will almost certainly never be reviewed by the product owner nor by the developers. So this is an opportunity for the testers to create a third viewpoint on what the product is supposed to do. Not good. And here's the SBE document flow. There are only 2 documents. We need requirements documents and we need architectural documents. But we don't need detailed design documents that list additional boundary conditions and special cases. All of those should be in the requirements. And we don't need any test cases. The requirements are identically the test cases. And that doesn't mean that the requirements tell us what to test. It means that we create, the QA team creates an interpreter that will run the requirements, just like a Python interpreter runs Python programs. So our requirements become executable. We can run them against our system, and the interpreter will tell us which requirements pass and which requirements fail. So why would you write test cases if you can run your requirements? And why would you need a requirements traceability matrix if your automation test report is a list of the requirements and each requirement is either green or red? It's not too difficult to hand that report to a product owner and for a product owner to understand what's working, what's not working, what's the impact on the customer. And QA teams typically spend a huge amount of time reviewing and modifying, first of all, writing, and then reviewing and modifying test cases when the requirements change. Specification by example completely eliminates that. So this is not a QA tool. It is a radically different, radically agile development methodology, and it is a radical paradigm shift. Nog is over here going, wow, I've got to wrap my brain around this one. And this absolutely maximizes the amount of work not done. Go ahead, Nog.
Yeah, this is fantastic because the reason is, I think you have mentioned the practical problems of any traditional way of doing things, even though we call ourselves as an agile. But still we have some hereditary issues that we need to deal with.
Yes,
Apart
things that
from,
we think are essential.
yeah.
Yeah.
The way
So,
we do things, they are essential.
so basically, I think what I'm getting here is the BA kind of gives us that requirements by an SBE, and then I'm visualizing that a QA team is going to churn these requirements into the automation test cases, and most of the time, the QA will be spending time in the automation of these requirements into a test cases, and that will be the input to the developers.
Close.
Okay.
There are no separate test cases.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
The
Okay.
requirements are the test cases. We'll see how that works.
Oh, I love
Excellent.
this. I can't wait.
So another principle, sustainable development. Even in an Agile project, the BAs often throw the requirements over the wall to the developers, and then the developers throw the code over the wall to the QAs. And if the BAs take too long writing the requirements, they cram the schedule down on the developers. And then the developers cram the schedule down on the QAs. In a properly run Agile process, cram down doesn't happen because the CIO understands define the schedule or define the scope, pick one. But we've all been in organizations where the CIO or the VP of development says, I want to define releases and dates for the next 9 months, and then we're going to use Agile to do the development. And I had a CTO tell me that in a job interview once, and I looked at him and I thought, no, you're not. That's not how it works. So thank you, but I don't want the job. Don't want to work here if that's that's what you think Agile is, because I'm not going to change your mind. So anyway,
Classic.
yeah, schedule cram down. We've all seen it. This methodology prevents schedule cram down. You can't have it. The requirements are written collaboratively. The BAs can't throw them over the wall to the developers, and the QAs can begin automating even before the requirements are finished, often before the developers begin coding. And when the tests are ready before the code is finished and the developers, not the QAs, are running the tests, the developers can't throw the code over the wall to the QAs. So eliminating the possibility of schedule cram down is a big step towards sustainable development.
I think the reason for not having that wall is because of a evolutionary nature of the requirements are coming up, and as the requirements are being written in the SPE format, even before the requirements get solidified, whatever, right? The grooming calls are going on. I mean, the sprint, the story review calls are the story refinement calls are going on. Even during that time, the QA is cranking up the automations, and at the same time, the developers are developing the code. So this cycle continues during the duration of the sprint. Is that the reason why there is no wall?
Yes.
Okay. Gotcha. Cool. Thanks.
Another principle, deliver working software frequently. Well, SBE eliminates a lot of work. The detailed design documents, the test cases, the maintenance of the test cases, time spent fixing defects. There's a well-documented case study at a large French bank. They had great metrics. Their developers spent 35% of their time fixing defects. And a consultant introduced 2 methodology changes into their Agile development process. He introduced TDD, test-driven development, where you write the unit tests before you write the code. And at the functional level, he introduced specification by example, or BDD. And 9 months later, the developers were spending 4% of their time fixing defects. How much shorter can you make the delivery cycle if you get back 30% of your developer's time? A typical developer spends 30 to 40% of their time fixing defects. And if SBE can reduce that to 4% or less, we'll talk about less, then you get back 30 to 40% of your developer's time. What's that worth in schedule? So this absolutely shortens the delivery cycle. Whoop, sorry about that. The first principle behind the Agile Manifesto: satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Well, collaborative writing of requirements prevents many defects because the developers don't spend time writing really good code that does the wrong thing. And using concrete examples, as we will see later, prevents more defects. At Raytheon, I worked with a data science team, data scientists and developers writing code, building a library that the data scientists were using to do their analysis. Once we had a solid SBE process in place, the developers made a release every 2 sprints, like clockwork, every 2 sprints. In a year, they delivered 2 defects to QA. If they only delivered 2 defects to QA, they spent a lot less than 4% of their time fixing defects. When the developers can run the test before they open a pull request, if there's a bug, they know exactly where to go find it, and they can fix it really quickly. If we don't find the bug until a week later, they don't even know which check-in caused the bug, and it takes a lot longer to fix. So specification by example eliminates a lot of work that we thought was essential. And by eliminating that work, we can deliver valuable code faster. If it delivers more features faster with fewer bugs, then we're fulfilling the highest priority behind the Agile Manifesto. So here are our 5 reasons. SBE says requirements should be written collaboratively. SBE leaves not done a very large amount of work. SBE eliminates schedule cram down so we can have a more sustainable pace. And it shortens the delivery cycle so we can deliver more frequently. And it gives us back 30 to 40% of the developer's time so we can deliver more value earlier. So what is it? Well, what is an elephant? And when I asked that question, how many of you immediately drew this diagram in your head? How many of you immediately saw this? We naturally think in terms of examples. It's the nature of our brain. So specification by example is a methodology for writing requirements that says all requirements must include concrete examples. And because it changes the requirements, it also affects the developers and the testers. So how do we actually write requirements in this methodology? Well, specification by example, gosh, y'all are not asking many questions.
No, we are waiting for these
Leslie,
examples.
I'm like, how is this happening? What are we doing? I want to know more.
The
Okay.
example might give us more information. We're waiting for this. So you got
Okay.
into the right point at this time.
All right. So specification by example says that we have to write requirements in a given, when, then format. Given these preconditions, when this event happens, then this is the expected result. And this given, when, then format is called Gherkin. And since we've not had many questions, I can take the time to tell you why it has that strange name.
Question.
Can I
though,
say
this one.
why? I don't know why, but I do
Nog,
that a gherkin is a pickle.
it's
That's
a,
all.
yes, a small
I don't know
pickle.
what the gherkin is, but I'll wait for your expertise, opinion. Oh,
It's a
sorry.
small pickle or a small cucumber.
But my
So,
question is a bit coming from a traditional world, right? So
okay.
what we do in all our conditions, current situations is that we have this as a let's say, for example, I think I forgot, I'm trying to remember. As a customer, I would like to do this so that I don't know, I want this feature so that I can do this, right?
Yes.
So how is that different? Because they're in as a role, and then I'm telling what feature I want, and I'm telling that why I want that feature. How that is different to from this?
I'll show you.
Okay.
So it's called gherkin. The guy who, one of the leading practitioners in this field, Aslak Hellesoy, he's Norwegian. He was on the train returning to the UK where he lives, and his wife was with him. And he had been working on his laptop creating the first tool that provided a good framework for automating these requirements. And he turned to his wife and he said, I want to release this as an open source project. But in order to do that, I need a name for the project. And I don't know what to call this thing. What should I call it? And she said, well, when you run the requirements, you want them to turn green, to come back green. Green like a cucumber, so call it cucumber. And he looked at her and he said, that's okay for today or maybe for this week. But beyond that, we've got to come up with an appropriately geeky name for it. Well, that was, I think, 15 years ago. It's still called Cucumber. His company was Cucumber Limited. And I've heard him tell this story. So the format in which you write the requirements for this is called gherkin, a small cucumber.
Is gherkin is an English word, or is it a
It's an
Norwegian
English
slash
word.
Swedish?
It's an English word.
Okay.
Yes. When you look at the London skyline, there's a gigantic building and it's sort of black and white stripes and diagonals. They call that skyscraper the Gherkin.
Really?
Looks like that's the small
Ha.
pickle in the jar.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
There are a couple of other words that are used less often. And is frequently used to add additional preconditions given an active customer account and these other preconditions. Also used to add additional outcomes. Then the account balance will be updated and whatever. We can use but interchangeably with and if we want to emphasize that it is a negative. And but can also be used after when, but that is very rare. It usually means that someone has written bad gherkin, a gherkin anti-pattern. Background. A background is a set of preconditions that apply to every requirement in a file, in a particular file of requirements. So we might have background, an active customer account, and an invoice that is 30 days past due. And then we might write 10 or 15 or 20 requirements that all revolve around past due invoices. Then we can write a requirement, when then, and another requirement, and additional preconditions, when then. And notice that those requirements don't have a given. They don't have to because they inherit the one from the background. They can have another one. And we can see that requirement number 2 here does have an and additional preconditions. So it's very handy when you've got a bunch of requirements that all have the same 2 or 3 things as preconditions. You just put them in a background, you read them at the start, and then you don't have to have them in every single requirement.
Got a
So
question.
go ahead, Nog.
So if you go back, so there, at least in my world, I have seen some scenarios where, for example, you write requirement one, right? So you're doing a requirement one, and then you're trying to go to the requirement two, but the requirement two is dependent on requirement one. So at the time, the given a condition for the requirement two becomes requirement one. Do you have you handled this kind of dependencies?
Don't do it.
Okay. Okay.
That's how you handle it. The SBE methodology says that every requirement should be independent. You don't know what other requirements have been run before. You don't know whether they passed or failed. So every requirement should be self-contained. I should be able to look at this requirement and understand it without any other requirements. If this
Gotcha.
requirement depends on the previous requirement, I can't read requirement number 2 and understand how it works or that it makes sense.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
that's the way that they handle that. So this is the anatomy of an SBE requirement. We have the context or preconditions, an action or event, and an outcome or expected result. Given tells us the context, when tells us the event or action, then gives us the expected result. Background is another way to specify the context. We can have and to add more context or more outcomes. And we also have examples, which we will see in just a few more slides. So here's what we do. We write a business rule from the user story. So the user story might be, as the accounting department, I want late bills to be charged a penalty. And we might write business rule. Bills more than 60 days late will be charged a 5% penalty. And then we illustrate the business rule with the gherkin. And, or, you know, we could have another business rule, late bills, charge a penalty on a sliding scale. We illustrate the business rule with the gherkin and illustrate the gherkin with concrete examples. So here's our user story. There's, you know, as the accounting department. And here is the requirement written using SBE. Given a bill that is 61 days past due, there's a concrete example, 61 days. When the bill is paid, then a 5% penalty will be charged. So now I have concrete examples. I've taken a user story, but I've added concrete examples to it. I've said, this is the precondition, this is the event, this is what I expect to have happen. And the developer reads the requirement this way. When the bill is paid, this is an event that comes to my software, and my software must handle it properly. So I first have to test the preconditions, given these preconditions. If the preconditions are met, then my software has to produce the desired result. Then this is the desired result. And the QA team reads the requirements this way. Given these preconditions, I have to create these preconditions. When this event happens, I must cause this event to happen. Then this is the expected result. I have to verify that the actual result matches the expected result. So this is a requirement. I mean, you can look at it and go, oh yeah, this I fully understand this is a requirement. It's also a test case because it says, given these preconditions, when this event happens, this is the expected result. That's the exact format of a test case.
Hey, Leslie, could I ask
Yes.
you a question
Of
about this?
course.
And it may, you know, I don't mean to be pedantic, but
No.
if we look at the statement here, given a bill that's 61 days past due, when the bill is paid, or in my mind, I think when the bill is assessed might be a better word there. A 5% penalty will be charged. because I think the payment of the bill requires an action of the person, but the software can assess every invoice at 61 days with or without customer engagement. So if we
This is a
want
great
to
example of how you writing requirements this way brings people to think about, okay, exactly what's happening here, and is this exactly the way we want to say it? And you're quite right. I wrote it this way just to be very simple, but the better way to write it would be when the total is calculated or
right,
something like
yeah.
that.
And then we could have another situation or another requirement that the bills or invoices will be assessed, or the totals on the invoices will be calculated every 24 hours. And then at that 24-hour mark, it will decide, is this bill 60 or 61 days? And at that point would add the thing. So we would have,
You mentioned 60 days.
yeah, or 59.
You're also illustrating another thing about specification by example, because you see the example of 61 days, you immediately think about 60 days. How much penalty is there if it's 60 days past due, Jen?
None.
None. So we would have another requirement. Given a bill that is 60 days past due when the total is calculated, then a 0% penalty will be charged.
All right.
So writing requirements this way naturally leads us to ask a couple of questions. Are there other important examples that produce different outcomes? Yes, 60 days. That's a different precondition, which produces a different outcome from the same event. Or suppose the account is suspended rather than active, or do we have new accounts that have never made a purchase, and are we charging them a penalty on the first purchase? And there are a lot of other things that we're going to think about when we're writing these requirements collaboratively. Notice that the user story didn't include the exact days on which penalties began and the exact penalty amount, but we have to in the requirement specification by example. Doesn't say by approximation. No, by example, concrete, discrete example. More than 60 does not work, not in this methodology.
So the biggest advantage of that kind of writing that an example, what I'm kind of embracing that one now is that there's going to be, you guys have mentioned that, and I just wanted to emphasize that most of the times what happens is we write user story as a part of like, as a customer, I would like to do this. And during that time, the more emphasis is given on the functionality, right? I want to develop this feature, let's say, to pay the bills, right? So the more focus goes on, okay, I want to develop this functionality. Does it needs to be a, this functionality needs to take an input of what, and then what should the output? So at some point of time, at least I'm realizing that we lose, or at least we don't discuss some of the use cases, and those trickle down to either failed tests later in the later part of the project, where the testing teams pick it up. At the time they might introduce those test cases, and then we might have to say, oh sure, we didn't discuss about that one, so okay, let's talk about that one. So in this, what I'm seeing here is those things come very upfront, those conversations.
Yes, absolutely. Because you're doing it collaboratively. The developers, every one of these examples is going to wind up being a test, a line of code that the developers write. And so the developers are going to be thinking about this. They're going to be asking these questions and assisting the product owner in writing these requirements. And the QA team the same way. QAs are trained to practice, to think in terms of boundary conditions and corner cases, and they're going to ask these questions.
Yes.
And then you write the requirements up front, so the developers spend less time writing bugs, writing high quality code that does the wrong thing. So Scenario is how we introduce a requirement. Scenario, a customer may store up to 3 credit cards, and then we have given when then, or scenario, and we follow it with a business rule. If a customer stores more than 1 credit card, 1 card must be chosen as the primary. Always follow scenario with a business rule. And then illustrate the business rule with the gherkin and illustrate the gherkin with concrete examples.
But all this is accomplished in one thing itself, right? So these are not different things, right? If you go back, when I write my gherkin, like given, when, then, that itself is nothing but example, isn't it?
Yes.
Oh, they're all included. They're all included in one. Okay, that's
Yeah.
cool.
So let's do a slightly more complicated one. Let's say that we want late bills to be charged a penalty on a sliding scale. So now we're going to use a scenario outline. A scenario outline is a sketch of a scenario. It is incomplete until we see the examples. And a single scenario outline is equivalent to multiple scenarios. So this is the same language that we saw earlier, given a bill that is some number of days past due. But we have this strange thing in angle brackets, days past due. That's a parameter that's going to be filled in from an examples table that's just a few lines further down. When the bill is paid or when the total is calculated, then now we have another parameter, penalty, will be charged. And now we have an examples table. So the first time we read this scenario outline, we go through, given a bill that is, and we substitute for days past due the value out of the first row in the table. We look down and we find days past due. We go, okay, given a bill that is 60 days past due, when the total is calculated, then a 0% penalty will be charged. And then we do it again. Now it's 61 days past due, it's 5%. Then it's 90 days, it's still 5%. 91 days, it's 7%. That is really easy to understand. If I tried to write this as a narrative requirement, you know how difficult that would be to write as a narrative requirement?
Oh, yeah.
That's true.
This is just,
Oh, sorry.
it is just so clarifying when you use examples. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah. So Leslie, when I'm looking at this table, I'm absorbing a best practice. And the best practice line is 60 and 0% and 90 and 5%. Because you have your, because you could skip that. You could just say days past due, 61.5 and 91.7. But by bringing in the 60 and 0 and the 90 and the 5, you're actually communicating to the user or to the person assessing this and using the information of like, okay, it gives me more context. So I think leaving in the 60 and the 90, even though it's 0% and no change, it's good communication for the user that says, I know there's a placeholder for 0% penalty, and I want to include that because I think it avoids it eliminates the work of people coming back with a question. Well, what happens at 60? They don't have to know.
There's one other reason for it.
Oh, is there even more?
When you automate, it's going to get tested automatically. So if the developer fumbles it and writes less than or equal to, or they should have written less than or, greater than or equal to, whatever, they make that very simple mistake. This is going to catch it because 60 will pass and 61 will pass. 90 will get charged 7%.
Right.
And suddenly a requirement comes back red. 91 passes, it comes back green. It got charged 7%, but 90 got charged 7. And the QA team is going to think about this. They're going to go, oh, wait a second, we left out 90.
Yeah. Mm.
So yes, it's a very powerful way of communicating. So let's talk about a library catalog search. Here's our user story, our business rule. Gherkin has something called a data table, which is very useful for illustrating complex preconditions and results. Library catalogs are complex. There can be multiple books by the same author. There can be multiple books with the same title. And data tables make it easy to illustrate the way a library catalog search rule works. So given these books in the catalog, that doesn't lend itself to a single discrete example. We can't put 42 in there and be done. But we can add a data table and make our preconditions really clear. There's our catalog. When a name search is performed for Stephen, well, I can look at that catalog and I can figure out what's going to get returned. Then only these books will be returned. Yep, that's the one that should be returned.
Can I add a tangent here for the future of AI development and integration into coding? The biggest problem with AI is you get too far down the stream and you realize it's not doing the right thing and you go back to the beginning. This brings the QA data set to the front of the process. And that's the thing I'm advocating for in our new Agile methodology and our DevOps process, is that you have to know ahead of time so that you can incrementally tell the client we have success, because sometimes you can't explain why under the hood with AI. But this data table up front is exactly the prescription for making sure your AI doesn't develop too far down the path and then be totally off base.
Yep.
So love it.
Let's look at a slightly more complicated requirement. I want to be able to search by first or last name, and I want to see partial matches. We're going to use the exact same gherkin given these books in the catalog, but we're going to change the catalog. So now this is just one requirement we should write for searching first and last names and partial matches, but we'll look at this one. So we've added another author to the catalog, and this author's last name is Stevenson. Still going to do a name search for Stephen, and somebody tell me what we're going to get back.
The Shining and Termination Shock.
Exactly. Then only these books will be returned. We're using the same gherkin. We're just changing the data table, but it's still very, very clear what this means. And think of all the additional requirements we could write about catalog searches, and most of them are going to use pretty much this gherkin. And when we reuse gherkin, the QA team has no coding to do. The interpreter already knows how to interpret this gherkin, how to automate it. You give it a new data table, it doesn't care. It's just going to build a catalog that way. So this is how you get to the point where you can deliver automation in sprint. If you can reuse your gherkin, the QA team has no work to do. And once you get a reasonable body of requirements, say 50 to 100 requirements written in a particular domain, a particular subject domain, if you have crafted your gherkin well, then you wind up reusing a lot of your gherkin. You're gonna reuse this given all over the place. Given a bill that is days past due, you're gonna use that a lot. when the total is calculated, boy, you're going to use that a ton of requirements in the accounting requirements, billing and revenue management. So when you're able to reuse Gherkin, not only do you have no test cases to write, you don't have any automation code to write either. One and done. Specification by example says that we have to show all of the important examples. We've talked about this a little bit. Do we have different contexts, different preconditions, which will produce a different outcome from the same event? Given the same preconditions, are there different possible events? So how does this help us? Well, it gives the product owner much higher confidence that the delivered code will work as expected. I was in a meeting with the director of development and a product owner, and the director of development was arguing that, we don't really need this specification by example because we've got a really large unit test suite, and that includes some functional tests, and we just need to enhance that. I didn't get a chance to say anything. The product owner immediately answered, responded, and said, I'm sure it's a good test suite, but I don't know what you're testing, and I don't know what you're going to deliver. But if we write our requirements this way and we automate them, I know exactly what you're testing, and I know exactly what you're going to deliver. It helps the developers because all of the boundary conditions are listed with concrete examples, and that's exactly what the developer has to code to. And it helps the testers. Again, the boundary conditions with concrete examples, that's exactly what has to be tested. And if you have business analysts in addition to product owners, working with concrete examples helps everyone think of additional examples. Jen just illustrated that for us. And asking these questions helps everyone think of additional concrete examples. It doesn't reduce the business analyst or PO's work up front, but it absolutely reduces the questions after the requirements are delivered. At General Motors, 9 months after the business analyst switched from traditional narrative requirements to specification by example, they said that it didn't save them any work up front. And in fact, it might be a little bit more work, but that they would never go back to traditional narrative requirements. Because once the requirements were delivered, there were no more questions. There weren't any phone calls or emails or instant messages or anyone walking up to their cube asking, what does this requirement mean? So for the life cycle, it saved them work. Might not have saved them anything up front, might have cost them a little more up front, but for the project, it's a huge win. So what's so hard about this? I mean, you write given when then. That's pretty easy. Well, yes, but we are creating a domain-specific language, a DSL, a formal grammar that we have designed for writing requirements for our business. And doing that is actually pretty easy unless you want it to be a good DSL. When I ask in a class, how many of you have ever created a class of developers, often full of developers and QAs, how many of you ever created a domain-specific language? About 1 out of 30 has ever in their career created a formal grammar. And they've only created one. How many of you think that it's going to be easy to do the first time you try it. It isn't.
It's going to seem easy.
Yes.
And then you're going to try to develop, and then you're going to hit the why didn't I order coffee break moment.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes, I hear you.
A lot of the value in this comes from crafting a really good DSL. When we do a good job, we find that we are reusing many of the same lines of Gherkin in multiple requirements. And when we reuse Gherkin, the POs, the developers, the QAs can all read it and they think, I have read these words before. I know exactly what they mean. The developers can read them and go, I've read these words before. I've already written the code. I can reuse that code. And the QAs can also think that I've read these exact words. I know what they mean. I wrote the code. I can reuse it. We've already discussed the fact that the QA team has no additional work to do when we write new requirements that reuse Gherkin. When we reuse Gherkin, the QA team writes less automation code because we're reusing rather than creating new Gherkin. Less code means less maintenance. And that means more work not done. Experience here is priceless. When I teach a BDD class, I tell my students the first time we write Gherkin, we all write bad Gherkin. I know because I did, and I got trained by ASLAC. Yeah, I mean, you can't get trained any better than that. But I still wrote bad Gherkin because I hadn't done it. And I learned and went, oh, we wrote the same basic concept 4 different ways. We shouldn't do that. We should use the exact same words every time. So it pays, if you're going to do this, it pays to find someone who has done this a number of times and get them to help you.
Hey, can I ask you, Leslie,
Certainly.
to me, it seems like you could have in the format of the output, and I'm curious, I don't know if you included like a sample Gherkin output readout, but it's like if you have one Gherkin at the top and then oh my gosh, the given when underneath, almost like indented, almost like here's the primary Gherkin, and then we have our requirements when then, like underneath rolling up to it.
Mm-hmm.
Or, that's, I'm thinking I'm a database person, so I'm thinking normalization there.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure things get so complex, you do actually want to repeat that Gherkin over and over again. But there must be some sort of middle ground of how we can do that, how we can present that as a document or documentation.
Well, using backgrounds is very helpful if you need to repeat something in your preconditions for the requirement. So use a background. The I
Oh,
suppose you could put the event in the background if you had a lot of requirements that had the same. No, but then you wouldn't have any difference in outcomes. So no, that wouldn't make sense. But you can certainly format it, structure it any way you like. Indentation, it doesn't care. However, the idea is understandability, communication. How do I write this for maximum understandability so that everyone in the company, everyone in this department can sit down and read this requirement and know what it means? So, for example, when I assist a group in writing these, the first couple of sessions are painful because all we're doing is trying to figure out what terms we're going to use and how we define those. So, okay, your company, do you have customers or do you have members or clients? Which is it? Pick one and use that. Don't use two or three different names for the same entity. I've actually seen code. I worked with a company where the product owners referred to their clients, I think, and the developers used customer for the same to mean the same thing.
Oh, my Lord.
Yes,
Yeah.
and actually had it in the code, customer name, customer ID, and all these sorts of things. And it's like, oh, that's painful. Another thing to do is to ban the use of the term BDD. If we're using a new methodology for development, the business analysts or product owners will say, great, go for it. I heard it's really useful, but it doesn't involve me. But if you say that you're writing requirements using the specification by example methodology, then the BAs or product owners have to be involved, and they know they have to be involved. And that is exactly how I got the business analysts to participate at General Motors. Because I told the QA team, we will never use the term BDD or the term test case when we are talking to the business analysts. We are always talking about requirements and specification by example. And when I told the business analysts weren't going to help us on this project because it was to replace an existing system. And the business analyst said, well, the new system needs to do exactly what the existing system does. And I'm like, yeah, but there are no requirements for the existing system. They're gone. They're long gone. So I sent out an email and said, okay, well, we're going to write requirements. And they're like, why are you writing requirements? Well, because I have to deliver automation in Sprint. And the only way I can do that is to write requirements using specification by example methodology. And they were like, are you writing test cases? And I very carefully said, I'm writing requirements. They had to come assist. So similarly, tell the QA team never to use the term test case. We're writing requirements. And before you Google BDD tutorial, please go read my blog post titled Never Google BDD tutorial, because there is so much bad advice out there. This is where Agile was 20 years ago, where there are some companies that are using and reporting just incredible results, and a lot of companies out there that are just doing it horribly badly and posting, on the internet, this is how we write test cases using Gherkin. And I'm like, if you say test cases and Gherkin in the same sentence, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like my favorite saying. I'm sure you all heard it. It's culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's like, I have to have this word test case. Well, everyone's gravitated towards it. That's what everyone knows. So they continue and propagate and perpetuate.
Yep. Additional
Sorry,
learning.
Doc, I thought I heard you there. Do you have something to say?
No, it was awesome. I was just enjoying your comment.
Additional learning. Several websites that you can trust. Goiko.net. Goiko is the guy who wrote one of the second really good book about this methodology. And he was the one who created the name specification by example. And he gave a very good explanation in the introduction to his book as to why he came up with that name. And Aslak agreed, yes, this is a better name for what we're doing than BDD. Cucumber.io, the website of Cucumber Limited. The BDD Coach, of course, my website. SpecFlow and Wreck and Roll if you are using C# Those would have C# examples, but everything you learned there would be applicable to whether you're doing this with Python or JavaScript or Ruby or Java or whatever. Books, Behavior-Driven Development with Cucumber. I have told Richard Lawrence I love everything about this book except the title.
Yes.
It's short, it's easy to read. It has a few programming examples in Ruby. You do not have to be a programmer to read and understand this book. I recommend it for BAs, product owners, everybody. This is my number one recommendation. Specification by Example by Goiko. And he does pronounce it Goiko, despite we wouldn't look at it and think it was Goiko. Has no programming in it. It's much thicker than Behavior-Driven Development with Cucumber. And the first third of it is about how do you create organizational change, which you may not need. But it's a good book. Writing Great Specifications. It's good. It's not my first choice. The Cucumber for Java book, Seb, Matt, and Aslak. It's got lots of programming examples. And if you prefer Ruby, why go for the Cucumber book. And happy to connect. Send me a connection request on LinkedIn and say, hey, was just looking at your presentation for Agile Boulder and sounds interesting. So, other questions? Marcus, Nirav, you've been very quiet. Minru, of course, you've been very quiet because your voice is...
Yes. And how about Nick? I think Nick's been with us the whole time. Are you
And
there?
Amanda, do y'all have questions?
Anybody?
I think I've used my talk time, so I'll not speak.
Ah, all
I
right.
thought it was so fascinating, Leslie. Like I have 2 pages of notes here.
Oh,
and
wow.
I just think the hardest part is the paradigm shift. The hardest part is clinging to, and we see this with AI as well. It's like, yeah, but if you automate me typing into this user interface, I won't have a job. It's like, no, we want you to show up and we want you to do things. Eliminating your boring work is exactly the point. And what can you, human that's employed, do for us? But this should be more broader, more well known. I think it's a really wonderful paradigm, a wonderful tool, and a wonderful way to approach things because it is much more human centered. It focuses on that conversation. Just like I pointed out, it was like, oh, well, you see these words and you're like, well, what does the word mean? And when you're having that discussion up front, instead of the QA person found something because there was the misunderstanding or the lack of clarity in the downstream, when you're handling all of that up front, it really does make things more efficient. And I'm so practical and pragmatic. I'm like, spend 90% of your budget up front and you'll need well, I mean, maybe not that much, but a lot of it up front. And then you'll have this less work downstream, less hassles. You don't get to the meeting and not have coffee. That's going to be my example for the next 3 weeks.
Yes. And some people, some teams argue that, well, this is too difficult up front. And I ask them, how much time do you want the developers to spend writing the wrong code? How much value do you get from that?
And I don't know, question to the group. Are we just so used to and therefore comfortable with how to handle defects and how to write test cases? Are we just so used to that we're it's harder for us to solve it upstream. And this is one of modern goddess and Scrum goddess philosophy is handle it upstream. It's so much less effort upstream than it is downstream to solve a problem.
I think the
But
biggest advantage that I see here is, at least in my uh, domains, we end up, because we are we think more from a technical point of view, being from a development and that background. And so what happens is we focus more on functionality of a situation of a given requirement. So basically, it needs to have bells and whistles and that kind of stuff, and we often miss, we cover like 60 to 70% of course the functionality, and then when it goes into the production or when it goes into the test teams, then when they come back with some kind of use case, many times we found ourselves that we did not discuss about that. So either that particular use case was not brought up during the grooming, and grooming is a very excellent grooming. We do a lot of story refinement. Sorry, the story refinement is where we have an active engagement of the product owner, business stakeholders, blah blah blah, whatever. But the way that the traditional stories are written is they will not pop up. They will not allow the participants of the meeting to ask questions, because that looks very straightforward. Like for example, if I say that a library search catalog search thing, then I would say the search button on the catalog should be used in order to key in the first name, last name, and once that submit button is written, then I should get the books. So if I write that test case, if I write that as a story, then most of the time people minds are blocked. Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah, what you're saying is right. But many times we forget about the partial, as I said, right, the partial pattern matching. No, that does not come to my mind at all, because the reason is you're talking about functionality. When you talk about examples, that's where your mind starts thinking about, oh, I would have missed that one, I would have missed this one. So that's a great thing.
yep, using examples just changes the whole thing, the whole conversation.
One other thing, we use a lot of Jenkins in our CI/CD
Mhm.
to write the automation of test cases. And when we do that, when we go with this particular, let's say if we go with this, then somehow there's a link that we need to provide from Jenkins back into the Jira where we write the user stories. So where we write the Gherkin format.
The way that I have recommended that the companies I've worked with, teams I've worked with, do it is to treat the requirements the same way they treat code. So when the product owner and when the three amigos have written requirements, sometimes once you get a reasonable body of requirements in a particular domain, the product owner can go write additional requirements without having to have the input from the other two teams, because they know the pattern, they know what gherkin to use, they know the grammar. But when they have written those requirements, they open a pull request to check those requirements into the source code repository. And that pull request gets treated exactly the same as a code pull request. Typically meaning one developer and one QA person has to review and sign off on the requirements. Once those two sign-offs are finished, then the requirements are merged into the source code repository. And then you can run them. So at Raytheon, for example, our definition of ready was that all of the requirements have been written in Gherkin. And our definition of done was that all of the requirements have been run and came back green. So you have, 10 user stories for this sprint. You might have 10 requirements or 15 requirements or whatever. Obviously, if you have a user story about searching first and last names and partial matches, you're probably going to have more than one requirement for that user story. But once those requirements have been written, then the developer can pull a ticket from Jira, make the changes, and then they run the requirements to see if they got it right.
All right, cool. Thank you very much.
And yes, it is
Excellent.
a paradigm shift. It is because, yeah, we think we need a defect tracker. Well, as as I've said several times, at Raytheon, if they felt they needed a defect tracker, I could go to Target and get them a refrigerator whiteboard, and they could track both of their defects on that.
Having a couple of beers there.
Very good.
Excellent, Leslie. I would have to say that I don't know when and where this will come in, but definitely, I think this has provided a new perspective, or I would say, new window into the upcoming future of complicated. Because the reasons is the requirements are not going to become easy with all the AI coming in, and we have now the customers are previously when we write in a feature, obviously we know that this customer is only on online, but now we need to figure out the customer can be on the mobile, or customer can be on the tablet, customer can be, I don't know where they're accessing it from, right? So the requirements are going to become complicated as we go, and this might be a kind of handy, or definitely a good thing that people can embrace.
Yeah, and I just want to double down on that, Leslie, and that it's so interesting. This is really the first time I've been exposed to all of these concepts, and they're so resonant. They're so real. It's so pragmatic. And with the advent of I think this is exactly what AI development needs. As
I
I
agree.
before, because it is your quality up front. While you're writing it, you are also identifying how to check it so that at each stage, you have something specific and real to prove what you're doing. Because there's only so much acceptance of, we don't know how it works, it just works. And when you're doing something for Raytheon, they're like, no, 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 no. And I wonder, so this is my prediction, perhaps. This is so fundamentally useful for AI development that maybe this is what brings BDD and SBE more to the forefront of here's how is a more realistic approach to get your AI development done.
That could be.
So
I think the two will work well together.
very well together. So I'm so excited we have this, because as I'm getting more and more into this world, everyone is paradigm shifting. We have to. Everyone's seeing it in the ecosystem, in the environment, the landscape, everywhere. People are saying things are changing. And that's a great moment, right? Because when someone's saying, hey, things are changing, of course, we're fearful about those changes. But then having a lifeline that says, this is how you can have your evidence-based approach to AI. That's something nothing else is offering. And so I see this process fitting in perfectly in the next maybe 6 months, 12 months. And that maybe that's a good selling technique or a good proposal that you could have of like, all right, Raytheon, now you're bringing in AI. This is the thing you're going to need in order to prove your cases all. So I'm just so very excited about this, and we're gonna tap you, but for my next Raytheon, I'm calling you B coach.
All right.
Right.
Sweet.
Thank you, Leslie.
So much, everybody.
See you
Have a
guys.
wonderful night. Thanks for joining.
All righty. Bye.
You too, everybody.
Bye. Have a good one. Thank you.
Bye.